subject. The subject of this lecture is psychic self-defense, and was given in Phoenix, Arizona during an extensive tour of North America in 1976. Many people have experienced nightmares, anxiety attacks, woken up terrified in the middle of the night, felt an unseen, often malefic presence, and so on. Much of these phenomena can be associated with an imbalance of the inner vehicles of the individual, but some of the phenomena, and more than many would suspect, can be traced to the influence of spirits, elementals, negative astral beings, and other forms of involutionary forces in the inner worlds. They are attracted by the increased light and sensitivity of spiritually evolving people. This is the subject of this excellent lecture, a subject that is of vital importance to all who endeavor to know themselves. Listen carefully to what is said. You never know when you might need to take heed of the advice.
Psychic self-defense. I suppose the interest in this subject has been accentuated in recent times, in the last few months or even 2 years, by the film of exorcism, in fact the film called The Exorcist, and most people who had never heard of the necessity to defend themselves psychically from attack became interested in the subject as the result of that film. And I want to start off by saying that I'm going to introduce the subject, and we'll cover it for about 45 minutes, and then after a short break, we're going to invite you to submit questions which should be written down and handed in to the monitors who will be in the sidewalks here. And we will select a few of these questions and I'll deal with them after that short break. This is a subject that is so abstruse and intangible that unfortunately I must approach it particularly from my own point of view, relating to you some case histories of my own, experiences of my own, but in studying classical teachings on ancient wisdom related to the subject, I find my experiences coincide very close with them. What we need to know, first of all, is what can be attacked. What can be attacked? There is much argument for and against the possibility of physical effects being marked, for instance, by an attack in the inner worlds. Is it possible, if you are attacked inwardly in the astral world, for you to have a mark on you when you awaken or return from that world? Annie Besant said that she was attacked once and she bore a mark on her for the rest of her life. I can only speak from my own experiences. I have suffered attack, certainly, and violent attack, certainly. I have not shown any marks, but I must say that I have, on many occasions in the initial stages of my esoteric endeavor, been affected emotionally and mentally by those attacks. But one would expect to be affected emotionally and mentally. After all, we grow up with psychic attack. We grow up with having, as it were, as children, nightmares or night terrors, as they are called by the medical profession. Some of us are more susceptible to these night terrors. If you are born in cancer, you tend to be very susceptible to them. If you are born with cancer rising, you are far more susceptible to them. And so we mustn't think that we are unusual because we have experienced psychic attack. On the other hand, it's a very good thing to know how to deal with persistent psychic attack and how you can offset it and deal with it. We must remember that we are all of us fast becoming occultists. By that we mean we are fast becoming people who know that there are hidden forces and energies that we can call upon and use And it would be ridiculous to ignore those forces if we know how to use them. We should use them. We, all of us, are aware of what constitutes our inner vehicles, the vehicles that can be attacked. We are aware, of course, that the physical body is only an outer framework for a far more complex situation which lies within us. The physical body is something that is interpenetrated by a nimbus of material or energy known as the etheric body. The etheric body is very seldom attacked. The etheric body can be affected really only when you are continually in close contact with somebody or with a group. The etheric body very, very seldom leaves the proximity of the physical. It interpenetrates the physical, and if it was indeed drawn away from the physical body, the organs would be attacked by bacteria very rapidly, disease conditions would set in, and life would be removed. Fortunately, there are very, very few people who are able to sap us, who are able to attack us at an etheric level. And you can deal with them very, very quickly by just getting out of their presence. They have almost to touch you before they can affect you etherically. However, if they do affect you etherically, and many such individuals walk under the name or work under the name of esoteric healers. Somebody said today, I think it was my friend Comer. You do know Comer, don't you? Oh yes, he was here just a minute ago. Well, he hurt himself the other day, and I was offering my solicitations to him, and somebody at the table tonight said, would you like a little healing? And he said, oh no, please not. And it takes me back to a festival that we held in South Africa in 1958. I was sitting on the veranda of my chalet, enjoying the morning sun, when suddenly coming up the hill towards me was a very old lady that I knew well, and she had a walking stick and she was hobbling because she had an awfully difficult arthritic hip. And she came up and she said, oh, Dr. Baker, may I rest here for a while? Can I go into the chalet and hide? I said, my dear, what is the matter? She said, there's a group of people coming up here to heal me. And sometimes the healers, the esoteric healers, can be a little determined. And I'm very much afraid that sometimes the laying on of hands in the name of esoteric healing can be a process of withdrawing vast amounts of etheric energy. We must remember also that in any sort of relationships which bring about physical contact, and I'm meaning sexually as well, that there is a tremendous interplay and interchange of energies. The actual climax or orgasm of sexual contact leads to tremendous transfers of energy. And some people can virtually be vacuum cleaners in this respect and remove vast amounts of etheric energy from your bodies. You must appreciate these factors because they come into our daily living. Then we have, of course, the factor of the astral body. And the astral body is a body which is that one which is most prone to attack. The astral body, as you well know, is the body that we slip into in our consciousness when we go to sleep. It is the normal position for the consciousness to reside in when we sleep. The consciousness lies in the astral body, which is just out of apposition with the physical. Now, the astral body is one in which we can constantly be reached by others, and this is because their astral bodies are easily projected to us, and we, whilst we are out of the body, can easily be attacked by them in this way. We need to remember that the aura has been described by very numerous people, not always accurately, and indeed the interpretation of the aura is often a matter of conjecture. Some of the things that are relevant to my subject here tonight, however, are the facts that we possess a dweller on the threshold. By that we mean that constantly we are elaborating emotional forms. As we feel, as we think, we create emotional forms. Being afraid of spiders will create an image, an astral image of spiders, and when that image of the spider is drawn to us, and it can be drawn merely by walking through the dark and experiencing a leaf or a cobweb going over your head, immediately you think, oh, spiders. The moment that that occurs, this spider form, thought form in your mind, is filled with emotional energy. It becomes rampant, and it has a cord, a link to you. And so we are surrounded in the aura, and that would be in people who are emotionally unstable, would be surrounded, as it were, with what we call collectively the dweller on the threshold. Thought forms that are constantly being extinguished. When we grow up, we extinguish a lot of our childhood fears, and thought forms which are growing and constantly coming into our attention. And when we become in a state of fear, we start to hemorrhage astral energy tremendously. We give it out, and these thought forms become rampant. And quite frequently, when people learn meditation, when they are not yet emotionally ready for it, they are people who will say to you, the moment that I try and clear my mind, immediately all sorts of horrible thoughts come into it. And in fact, the activity of people in everyday life tends to keep a lot of their thought forms away from them. The moment, as they say, they sit and brood, then these thought forms become strong and vibrant and enter into the aura and pester them. So we have to remember that much of psychic attack comes from our own creations. If we are fearsome, if we are unstable emotionally, we are creating, living. When I say living, I don't mean having a life force of their own. We are creating living entities of our own making. And these thought forms, when emotionally or astrally strengthened, can pester us. And we should always, when we think that we are the subject of psychic attack, first try to eliminate the possibility that we are being attacked by something we have created. As we become initiate, as we tread the path of discipleship, we very soon learn that these thought forms have to be strangled, have to be destroyed. And the way to destroy them is, as Madame Blavatsky says, tear them out by the roots. And there is a very, very fine book written by her translation of The Voice of the Silence, which is a manual preparing the disciple again for the great trials and tribulations of initiation. And no disciple can mount the face of the cliff of initiation until he has faced up to his own dweller on the threshold, the collective thought forms making sometimes an individual entity. Oscar Wilde described this dweller on the threshold in his book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, where Dorian Gray is a man who never grows old, but all his vices and all his fears are depicted on a picture, a portrait that he has kept secretly in his room. You can, of course, read about the dweller on the threshold when you read the book by Sir Bulwer Lytton called Zanoni, where the dweller is mentioned there. So this is the sort of equipment that is most frequently attacked. In exorcism, or rather in the picture The Exorcist, we had an example, a supposed example, of how an astral being had the ability, by virtue probably of karmic links and so on, had the ability to force the astral body of a little girl, an adolescent girl, force it out of alignment with the physical and possess the physical body itself. And this astral entity, supposedly by some to be the devil, then proceeded to occupy and use the physical body of this child. That picture had a tremendous shock effect on the population of the Western world, as you well know. Well, it has elements of truth in it, and one of those elements which are untruthful is that you need to have an exorcist to get rid of any sort of possession by your own thought forms or by an astral body of another being. An exorcist, meaning somebody trained in religious sciences, adopting a strict procedure of ritual to exorcise the occupying entity or devil, is not necessary. All that is really needed is somebody with a strong, stabilized, integrated inner vehicles to be present and to watch over the individual and to take care of the individual. However, we do seem to remember only the things that the church hand down to us with any sort of respect, and so the idea that exorcism is a church ritual has persisted. That does not mean to say that some of the church regalia do not assist in psychic self-defense. On the contrary, they do. It is certainly true to say, for instance, that the Lord's Prayer is the most powerful mantram that we know in psychic self-defense. And if ever you have the wits about you to remember to say the Lord's Prayer, to sound the Om and some other very well-known mantras like Om Mani Padme Hum, these tend or would certainly help you in moments of psychic attack. Now, with that preamble, I can go on to a more specific description of some elements of it. Many of us are often concerned at our inability to be able to help a child, perhaps a child in our own family. We should remember that a child tends, or for that matter anybody, tends to be protected by those that love them. There is an occult explanation for this. If this is the mother and father and this is the baby, as it were, the mother and father have strong or integrated emotional attachments with the child. When the child is very young, the astral body is hardly integrated at all. In fact, it's just in a state of forming, and that astral body needs some element of protection. And there is protection given, though the parents do not know it. There is protection given to that child. The parents have the child emotionally within their aura, and it is not just the mother, but the father too, protects the child in a sort of cocoon until that baby is old enough to integrate its astral body and to stand on its own feet. Sometimes, however, this can lead to unhealthy emotional attachments between parents and their children, so that the child, as it grows, remains in this sort of emotional cocoon and cannot fend for itself, does not learn the value of independence. And it is very, very hard for such children not only to free themselves from the cocoon of astral material of their parents, but it makes it very hard for the child to mature, sometimes to mature sexually. Sometimes this condition can lead to sexual aberrations and other manifestations of its inability to mature under the emotional blanketing of the parents. However, we do know that normally children are well protected in this respect when there is a close-knit family. Rudolf Steiner pointed out, not once but many times, that a family is a living creature. A father, a mother, and the children represent a single entity. In fact, Noel Till would tell you that you can cast the horoscope of the day of the marriage, or you can cast the horoscope of a family from the moment of true conception of the first child. And that family will have a birth, a life, and a death, just as any business. The point I'm making here is that quite frequently the excesses of the parent, emotional or mental excesses or aberrations of the parents, may not show in themselves as an illness or a disease, but as Steiner says, very frequently, the emotional imbalances of the parent may show up in the child being the weakest part of the family unit. So we should always remember that it is possible to help a child, a baby, if it is suffering from night terrors, which are forms quite frequently of astral attack, by sending our loving thoughts to them and protecting them in the way that I have suggested here. Quite frequently in the West, the form of attack that usually occurs is sexual. And it seems to be that people can survive the hard blows of an attack in the astral world by some villainous entity, but when it comes to the sexual sort of attack, there is often grave concern of a person. We have a tradition telling us about sexual attack. During the Middle Ages, when most of us who had incarnated in the last millennium were Catholics here in the West, we would have remembered the tremendous wave of sexual attacks which constituted a tradition which we still remember today under the headings of succubi and incubi. By this we mean that in the Middle Ages there appeared from time to time series of actions against so-called witches, women who proclaimed it abroad that they had been sexually attacked by the devil or by demons. And even though they were threatened with the Inquisition and asked to recant, they would not. They would go to their deaths being burnt alive rather than recant and retract the fact that they had had intercourse really and truly, certainly, with some sort of real living devil entity. Well, the truth is, of course, that many of these witches would cover their bodies with certain drugs like belladonna and other materials, and in this condition frequently experienced ecstasy, as you could quite easily anticipate from such an action. But very frequently this led to a forcing of the astral body out of alignment with the physical, without them even knowing about it. And then astral beings would attack them sexually, and this very vivid experience would be brought back into consciousness with them feeling that they had never even been out of their body. It was a reality. So the phenomenon of succubi and incubi remains still with us today, and many women, even if they have not even read about that in history books, still produce it from the collective unconscious of our race. Sexual intercourse in subtle levels, of course, has never been brought under the attention of scientists. How could it possibly be? But there is a strong belief amongst many people, women especially, that some of the children that they produce have not been the children of the husband. Now that does not mean that they have been unfaithful, but many a woman has sworn for certain that the child she has produced is so unlike the husband and so like another man that she has loved that they have felt that they have in some way been caused to conceive by not the husband but by another person. I'm going to read you just a brief quotation from Dion Fortune's book on psychic self-defense, which gives you an example of this. An even more curious case came to my knowledge some years ago. A woman told me that in the days of her youth she had been engaged to marry a man to whom she was very deeply attached, and who was murdered while working as a missionary in West Africa. That's an important point. Having lost the only man she felt she could love, she consented to marry a second cousin who had long been in love with her and who was a semi-invalid. When she had relations with this husband, she always visualized the form of her first lover. She herself was short, dark, and petite. Her husband, a blood relation, was similar to her in type himself, and a weed into the bargain. But her 3 sons, the sons of this marriage, were tall, upstanding, blonde men of the Nordic type, bearing a strong resemblance to the dead man. The truth of the story was vouched for me by a friend of my family, and so on, of that family, and so on. The suggestion here was that as the women lay with her husband during the build-up towards orgasm, she constantly visualized her first lover who had been killed and believed that he had produced the conception resulting in the birth of these 3 blonde children. Well, of course it sounds way out and ridiculous, but we have to remember that there are always exceptions to rules. We have to remember that the young man had been murdered, that his astral body would have been very, very powerful. You have to remember that there's a difference between the astral body of a man murdered and pulled out of his physical in a moment, without a moment's notice, and an old person's astral body, an old person who has been aging and dying for a long time. The difference in the 2 bodies is great. The astral body of the young man would have been vibrant. It would be almost certain that he would be attracted to his lover. And maybe they had many times intercourse in the astral world. Who knows whether this is so impossible as to produce a conception. Today we know that the mind can affect the genetic structure, can affect the structure of the DNA molecules in cells, and so on. Is it not possible that this could be a conception wrought from inner levels? Some believe it is true. Well, I only say this, that if the teachings of the Masters are correct, that the highly developed of the human race in the centuries ahead will not produce children under normal methods. Children will be produced merely through a powerfully concentrated thought between the 2 who make up the marriage partners, and actual sexual intercourse will slowly fall into disuse in the root races that lie ahead of us. It's surprising how much attention is paid to psychic attack today. On British television, which is a very, very conservative body, I remember the other night hearing a few psychiatrists discuss some unusual aspects of attack, and they were discussing their patients, and one of the psychiatrists said, I have a patient, a middle-aged lady who is a widow of long standing, and she must be very schizophrenic, because she tells me that almost every night she is attacked sexually. And he went on to describe it, and then the other psychiatrist said to him, well, how are you treating her, he asked. And he said, I'm not. She's delighted with the situation. And that was on British television. So last year at the International Festival, some of you met a very famous lady in England who had been the subject of psychic attack for some time, and she approached me for help. She believed that she was being attacked by her daughter-in-law, and asked for help. I asked for a photograph of the daughter-in-law and brooded over this for some time, and then one evening later I was able to project myself to the good lady and investigate situations in her neighborhood. And indeed I found her worst fears were true. The daughter-in-law was violently jealous of her control or her domination of her son, and this resentment was leading literally to violent attacks on the mother-in-law. I was able to use occult methods for solving this problem. During an attack, I was able to flood the attacker, the daughter-in-law, with energies which I use normally in healing in the inner worlds, and subdue her, and then give her a very, very straight talking to, and at the same time occasionally breathing in my physical body in a way that I'm going to show you tonight, so that the words could not only be heard by her, but remembered by her. And indeed, I can report that these psychic attacks have fallen off. I have myself been asked to be present at what was a very, very violent psychic attack in a stately home in England. These old houses are very, very frequently sites for psychic attack. You have to remember that old houses harbor astral vibrations. More than that, they harbor astral substance. And in an old house, it is very, very easy for some earthbound entity to draw astral energy, even etheric energy, from the walls of the rooms of old houses, and with this assistance to materialize at least part of themselves and use it in attack. I must just mention that we hope to bring to the next festival an extraordinary man from Spain. This gentleman, a professor in the University of Madrid, has described and done research work into frescoes on the walls of certain churches. And these frescoes have shown that they change their design, especially if they are faces of people. The faces change considerably. And this professor has had faces on frescoes, on walls in old churches, photographed progressively, and has been able to show that these faces' expressions change, indicating that perhaps at an astral level attempts are being made in the material of these walls, the astrally saturated material of these walls, to convey some sort of message or indication through to our world. That seems way out, but I assure you this gentleman is very, very academic, and we will have the opportunity of viewing his films and pictures in the next international festival. I was talking about a stately home in southern England. I was invited there by my millionaire friend, whose name I suppose I could tell you. His name is Kenneth Shipman. And he had a huge stately home, and he had just occupied it. And he and his wife were having the most appalling dreams at night and nightmares. And they begged me to come down and spend 1 or 2 nights with them. Now, I am a very, very, I wouldn't say stable, but a person that is not easily moved by anything, and certainly in the inner worlds. And I went down there and agreed to sleep 2 nights. And I was astounded to find that their worst fears were true, that it was a very, very awful sort of place, and that there was one particular entity that kept coming into my bedroom anyway and pestering around. And so we decided that we would do something about it. He got a world-famous materialization medium down, and we all attended one evening, and I was present in order to supply, I don't know whether it was the courage, but the energy for them to face up to this entity. And the medium went into a deep trance and called out, if there is anybody there wanting to speak, tell us now what it is you have to say. And after a period of about 10 or 20 minutes, this medium went into great contortions, and before my eyes I was staggered to see rips and tears appear in his cheek, and blood even come from these tears where he had apparently been clawed. And then, after some bit of a commotion, we managed to restore order, and a voice came through, and it turned out to be the voice of a groomsman who had been murdered in the house that we were in, that part of it being a converted stables. And we eventually were able to talk to this being, and he never pestered again. Now, that is a sort of exorcism that anyone could do. The fact that we brought in a medium merely meant that the medium could make more rapid something that would take a normal person some months to produce an exorcism of that sort. So don't think that these attacks are insuperable, and don't think that they just can't happen in your lives. They very frequently can. There is an old teaching about astral Siamese twins, as it were. And a Siamese twin at an astral level for you would be somebody with whom you have very, very strong emotional attachments. Very frequently, a possessive mother imposes herself on her son or daughter at an astral level. And this would be a very typical example of astral Siamese twins. The difficulty, however, here is that the closeness of the association means that there is an exchange of thought forms, and the one might be picking up the thought forms or emotional forms of the dweller of the other person. And this can be very, very disturbing and seem to give no possible explanation to the one suffering. Whenever you are under psychic attack, always examine your situation and be quite sure that there is no one so emotionally close to you. You may not even know that they have this attachment for you. Someone who is so closely attached to you emotionally that they are producing these unpleasant phenomena, and you are experiencing some of their thought forms. H.P. Blavatsky showed how easy it is for a husband and wife to grow like each other by sharing each other's thought forms. She also even indicated that a master and his pet may grow like each other through sharing their thought forms. And I'm sure every one of you have had an example of this somewhere or the other. We certainly often meet women who are the horsey type and begin to look like the horses that they ride. We very frequently meet men who are of the earthy type, and as Dion Fortune says of earthly type men, Father's in the pigsty. You'll know him by his hat. This phenomenon, of course, meaning that the father has grown to look like the pigs that he tends, of course. This phenomenon is very applicable to groups, and this is why I mentioned it. The moment that you form a group, the moment that you work together in a group, the moment that you begin to meditate in a group, there is a tremendous sharing of auras. If that is not so, then the group is not being integrated. You must understand that when you work in groups, you are making a sacrifice of some sort. You have to share each other's auras and begin to create not just your own note, but the note of the group. And it is well known that groups of people tend to grow like each other. People who are Quakers tend to be like Quakers. People who are Theosophists tend to be typed as Theosophists. I could describe a typical Theosophist to you, but I shan't do that here tonight for fear of offending half the audience. Perhaps I might mention that I'm a member of the Dallas Lodge of the Theosophical Society. I might also mention that I'm a member of the AUM movement, of which Ray Stanford is the leader here tonight. I think perhaps the most obvious example of how this can happen is with women astrologers. Women astrologers, I'm taking digs at all of you tonight. Women astrologers are absolutely typical of this. Get a few women together to discuss their astrology one afternoon of the week, and they grow absolutely like each other. They turn into a bunch of witches, and they discuss cases so intimately that you can't tell the difference between case histories and scandal. Well, doctors, of course, also fill this bill. However, we must remember then that when we get close to each other, we share each other's vibrations and we are subject to intrusions. We may not recognize them as attacks, but they are intrusions nevertheless. I want to say a word about mummification and also the process of cremation. The process of mummification has often been associated with psychic attack. The basis for this arises out of the obvious. In ancient days, pharaohs would not only sometimes be surrounded by doting servants who tended them from the moment that they were born. That was the usual thing in Egypt. But those servants would grow up with them and even enter their tombs at death and be voluntarily entombed alive. They would be sealed up with in the tomb with the pharaoh whom they loved, or a member of the pharaoh's family, swearing to protect him from any sort of attack, meaning, of course, mainly robbers, men who would rob the tombs of the pharaohs for their gold and jewelry. And there are many, many examples, not only from the tomb of Tutankhamun, where we have the example of Lord Carnarvon and a whole trail of disasters that followed his death being associated with the opening of that tomb, but many, many other examples. The rationale for this, of course, is that the servant dying alive in that tomb, aware of what he had to do to protect it, might not even know that he had even died. Might even, as this is the suggestion of the Tibetan master, that such entities entombed would draw away energy from their bodies lying in that tomb, or even from the body of the pharaoh. And it is very, very wise, especially for the occultist, to have his body cremated, because cremation destroys the attachments or reduces the attachments which a person may have for the earth world. And the finest action that all of us can have, of course, is to get away from the earth world as quickly as possible and move on in our spiritual evolution. Today we know from the teachings of the Tibetan and others that many of the diseases which take on epidemic form in the world are the result of corpses of very ancient origin and their remains being sometimes brought to the surface of the earth by violent explosions, atomic explosions, plowing of land, and volcanic actions and earthquakes. And indeed it would be a service to the planet to have the body cremated so that diseases that we bear today might not be brought suddenly out into the earth in 1,000 or several millenniums of time hence. I want to just mention a very strange story concerning the great physician Paracelsus. Paracelsus was the leading occultist of his century, the 15th century. He knew the human body well, and he knew the world of the occult. When he was dying, he had been attacked by a group of thugs set upon him by the medical profession. Does that answer the question about the medical profession? Somebody asked a little earlier. He had been set upon by a group of thugs, and he knew that he was dying. He called to his manservant and told his manservant that upon his death, his body would have to be macerated and minced up into small parts. And he was told, the servant was told, that if this was done properly, that Paracelsus would be able to resume his body again and be able to act through it. He would be able to materialize in his body again. Now, here again, in fact, this did not happen. The servant would not carry out the instructions. But there's an element of truth here. And certainly the maceration of the physical body would produce a tremendous amount of released etheric matter, and it might even enable a person to materialize for a short period to complete some work that had been left undone. certainly if this was all carried out in a dark room. Otherwise, the phenomenon of materialization which you saw on films this afternoon and in which I've investigated all my life is just nonsense. But technically, from an occult point of view, this action of Paracelsus could have been possible. How do we destroy persistent thought forms, emotional forms which intrude on us or come to us from those with whom we are emotionally linked or from those who attack us? How do we destroy them? Dion Fortune gives a very good method in her book, Psychic Self-Defense. She suggests that you visualize the form, call it up, and visualize it, strengthen it, and then make it explode. Visualize it exploding in front of you, disintegrating in front of you. And that I have found by practice in my early days to be a very, very good method of destroying any sort of thought form. I was using it not for forms that were intruding from the point of view of attack, but forms that were holding me, binding me, attaching to the life I had been leading. And I visualized those forms that were holding me to my old life, attaching me, disintegrating in the way that she suggested. I found it very, very helpful. She also suggested that you visualize a burning torch, and of course you must remember when you are fully conscious in the astral world, you are a creator. We are not yet complete creators on the earth. We are said to be gods in the making, and gods are creators. But in the astral worlds, we are quite capable of creating any form. Quite capable of doing it, depending on our degree of experience and how good an occultist we are. We can work there using shining swords, we can work there using burning torches, and we can hack at things that threaten there with these implements that we have visualized. Now that sounds incredible, but we are dealing with that sort of world. We can learn, and this is what I suggest is best for all of you, for your own safety and for the protection of families and so on. We can learn astral projection, and when we learn this technique, and I have given a seminar here at the festival on it, we can learn conscious movement in the astral world through projection, and in projection we can attack and break up many, many thought forms that pester people that we love. I remember on one occasion in the astral world seeing my sister being attacked by a group of villains, and they were clawing at her rings. I might say that my youngest sister did well in marriage. She was married 3 times and had clusters of diamond rings on her fingers. She always thought diamonds were a girl's best friend. And she used to wear these at night, and you know, she used to tell me how she had been constantly disturbed in her sleep by the most horrible forms, and she said, you know, this is just not me at all. I couldn't even visualize such terrible people attacking me. And one night I managed to get through to her, and I saw the cause of it. The cause of it was that she was wearing her diamond rings, and some of the diamonds were very old, and she was being attacked by entities trying to pull this jewelry off her hands. I make a habit never of having jewelry near me when I sleep, and certainly never having any dollar bills near me when I sleep, for the same sort of reason. If you could imagine the vibrations associated with a dollar bill, and particularly with $100 bill, then you would certainly never allow money to lie under your pillow at night. You know, as I have told many of you before, when you lecture tour as I do, sometimes 7 weeks non-stop in a different place every night, it can be pretty hard. You have to sleep in a different bed every night. And if you are at all esoterically sensitive, you are sensitive sometime during the night anyway as to who slept there the night before. And you relive, to a certain extent, some of the auric vibrations until they are used up. That's my experience. You sleep in a bed, and until you have experienced the nature of the person that was in there last, and especially what he was doing in that bed last, until you have used that vibration up, it is there, and it can be very, very disconcerting. We are prone to attack by all sorts of methods, let me assure you. Dionne Fortune describes how she, in her, I've done all this, and it's in my book on the techniques of astral projection. I thought perhaps I'd quote other people on the subject. She describes how in astral projection she could help people who were being attacked astrally. I'm going to read you one example from her book. I projected myself astrally in the way that I've already described and visited this poor lady one night. I perceived that from her solar plexus, as she lay asleep, there stretched a black, elastic, stringy-looking substance that resembled nothing so much as a stick of Spanish licorice that had been well chewed by a small boy. This went off into space. Upon trying to see its origin at the further end, I had a brief and far-off vision of a monastery with a Chinese type of roof perched on a crag amongst vast mountains. I tackled the situation by the simple expedient of passing my astral body between the line of the black substance and its origin, thus breaking it. It immediately transferred itself to my solar plexus, and for the moment I felt a surge of tempting thoughts urging me to get this woman under my thumb and exploit her to her full financial capacity. I cast these thoughts out and went for the rope of astral licorice in the manner that I have described, casting it off and searing the stump. She had visualized a flaming torch to do it. She broke the cord and seared it with this flaming torch, the stump, and had the satisfaction of seeing it curl up and disappear into the darkness. You could substitute any one of those stalks there, and it would be valid for what she is describing. I had told this lady nothing of my ideas because I wanted to see whether I could clear up the case by working solely on the occult hypothesis without any admixture of suggestion. Next morning I visited her to see how she was getting on and found her sitting up in bed eating a hearty breakfast and looking entirely different woman to the grey-faced, exhausted creature I had seen the day before. Without waiting for any inquiry from me, she said, "I don't know what has been done, but I feel as if something has been broken and I am set free." Now, another thing that you should do when you are faced by any elements of this dweller on the threshold which you have created, you must face the dweller. You cannot go into initiation until you have cleared up your dweller on the threshold. And the way in which it is done traditionally, when you're in the astral world and you are faced with aspects of your dweller on the threshold, you address it and you say, "I have created you, you are part of me, and I who created you will destroy you. You are as nothing." Now, the words are not so important. They don't have to be said exactly, although in past days ritual use of words was done. But it is the thought that goes with it. And you always know if you want to emphasize a thought, you say something at the same time. "I created you and I destroy you." And that emphasis brings down will into the aura while you're in the astral world, and this can assist you in destruction of any sort of thought form. Now, I'm going to give you a breathing exercise which some of you have heard me give in the techniques of astral projection. I have used this breathing exercise 1,000 times, and I'm not a hatha yogi. I do not sit and practice hatha yoga every day. But I have practiced this breathing and other mechanisms sufficiently well to know that it is an invaluable instrument for use in psychic self-defense. And of course I have to speak for people who can use the breath when they are in the astral world, which is mainly when they're asleep. But you can use it equally so during the day when you think that you are being got at by somebody. And you can be got at by people who are a long distance away, merely through their visualizing you. The breath is known in yoga as the bellows breath. And the bellows breath involves the necessity of sucking air in through the nostrils very, very rapidly. So rapidly that the edges of the nostrils flare. The antrum of the nostrils takes in this air, and very, very recently there is physiological evidence to show that there is a place of electrical excitation just inside the nostril, which causes tremendous electrical discharges when we breathe rapidly. Now, if you practice the bellows breath, it has a tremendous number of useful side effects. It strengthens the heart, it wards off colds in the winter, it can assist in the curing or the treatment of sinusitis. But for psychic self-defense, it is absolutely invaluable, used in full waking consciousness and when you're in the inner worlds. You must learn it so that it is reflex to you. It's no good in a psychic emergency to start clambering around in your mind for what breath to use. You must do it, as it were, very, very quickly and reflexly. And this is what you do. You suck the air in through the nose like this. Now, don't do it more than 4 or 5 times to begin with, because you will notice a slight darkening sensation. This means that the blood is turning very slightly alkaline, and you must have to practice this day after day for some weeks, once or twice each day. And as you practice it, you will find that you can do the breath longer and longer. I've seen Swami Rama do it 40 times, 10 to the front, 10 to the side, 10 to the front, 10 to the side, and 10 to the front again. And then I have trained a young man who was the weapon, was the target of psychic attack. I trained him to use this exercise himself. He was the young man who, incidentally, I quoted in my lecture on cowardice and courage, the young man who has reincarnated but was previous the Greek hero known as Xenophon. Now, this exercise is tremendously useful, and you should practice it, and one day you will find it helpful in psychic attack. I can only say that it makes you in the astral world like a Raja, a lord, a prize fighter compared to any dead person who exists in the astral world. And most frequently the serious psychic attacks come from astral shells. By that we mean the shell of the astral shell of a person who has been dead many, many years, and whose astral body has, as it were, allowed the inner entity to leave it, and what is left behind is merely an automaton. And very frequently these astral forms, automatons, you sometimes get young Nazis, you sometimes get men who have been hanged before the laws of execution were done away with, and this is the sort of person who attacks. Now, they're easily dispensed with if you have that breath. You have only to use the breath, and you can literally defend yourself there in any way that Beyond Fortune suggests, or even with your own fists. And nothing can stand against you when you use breathing while you are conscious in the astral world. I can't go into the subject more tonight, but I've certainly described it in my book, The Techniques of Astral Projection. By far the safest way as an occultist to protect yourselves is to work for the masters. To work for the masters. When you work for the masters and you slowly become part of their ashram by becoming first a probationary disciple and then an accepted disciple, when you work for them, they protect you because you are part of them. The ashram of masters and initiates, which each one of us belongs to, doesn't matter who you are, there is an ashram that waits for you. The moment that you work for them, you are part of them. Why should they allow their smallest finger to be attacked and not take efforts to stop the attack? Of course they will assist you. They won't intrude upon you. They won't intrude upon you if you're getting the worst of an argument in the astral world. But if there is a moment of anguish in which you are really at bay, as it were, and show that anguish, they feel it. And the master immediately, or through his initiates, they will immediately assist you. I've had this experience in my early days very, very frequently, and I would like to just describe some of the phenomenon involved, because one day I think some of you, if you haven't already had this experience, will find it useful. It seems that when you work with an ashram of masters, you are attached to them by a sort of globule of their energy. They throw part of, if that's the ashram there, then those who are alive and living and work in the world are constantly surrounded with some fragment of the ashram. And even when you go into the dream state in the astral body, you are contained within this sort of globule. And it may be that, or the globule is thrown around you. I've never been able to be quite certain. You see, I'm not basically clairvoyant. And I do know this, that when you are in a situation which is difficult, and as I must confess I have often done, shouted for help for the master, then I have noticed that it is just as if you were pulled out of the situation in a sort of bubble, and that the bubble is snapped off, as it were. It's as if you were in a great big field of bubbles like that, and you were pulled out and, as it were, twisted off from this astral experience. And I can only describe it as being something like that, in which you are taken out of the astral world and snapped away from it, and you come into waking consciousness. You see how difficult it is to describe these things. One can only appeal as a brother of the wisdom to you as brothers to help me to understand such extraordinary phenomena. Nevertheless, this is true. Now, how do we deal with psychic attack in a logical, systematic way? And I'm going to finish my talk merely with this advice. If you are under psychic attack, remember that in most cases of psychic attack, the person who wins is the person who persists longest. The person who persists longest. And that's why courage and persistence is so important on the path in that field and in many others. Decide what approach you're going to adopt towards those that attack you, or, if you like, what sort of conduct you're going to adopt in the world. Obviously, if you're an occultist and you have done meditation for many years, your approach to psychic attack would be very different from a normal person, naturally so. And we have to remember that this is true and accept the fact. If you know nothing about the inner worlds, then you fall into category 1. If you are somebody who can project astrally, if you are somebody that knows your way about a bit, then you fall into category 2, and the first category would not be necessary for you. Now, what action do you need to take if you're under psychic attack, either consciously or in the astral world? First and foremost of all is to maintain good health. You must maintain good health through the simplest measures. Get plenty of sleep. Get plenty of sleep. That's the first thing to remember. Maintain good bowel action. If there is any difficulty with this, then take steps to alleviate it with measures that you normally use. But if you're under psychic attack, you must get the sleep and you must have good bowel action. Have a simple and balanced diet. Nothing to excess, nothing excessively hot or cold, not too much meat. If you have to have meat during psychic attack, and you should have protein even if it's not meat, then please, not pigmented meat. Of the meats that you eat, it should be fish or at the most chicken, but not blood red meats like beef and even lamb. Avoid eating pigmented meat. Thirdly, stop all meditation. Stop all psychic activity. Stop reading occult works. Anything to do with the occult, just drop it for the moment. And then in leisure, in your leisure time, keep yourself busy. Always keep yourself busy during this period of psychic attack. Around the house, take on little jobs in the house that you have neglected until then. But stop reading, stop meditating. Use that time in practical things. Get hold of some practical hobbies and work on them. Try and not be alone if you can. Try and have somebody near you all the time. If you can't do that, then go out and do some shopping. Spend some time in the malls, or the malls as you call them in this place. Choose very carefully your companions. Don't have companions that affect you emotionally or mentally very strongly. Choose companions that make you feel good, that relax you and assist you in obtaining rest. Above all, avoid the lunatic fringe. Drop all your friends and companions who are in what we call that lunatic fringe of people. People who are extraordinary or have Uranus in the first house or something like that. You must be absolutely meticulous in your hygiene. Wash very, very carefully. Get rid of any possible septic foci in the body. If you have septic focuses in the nose or anywhere in the body, tend to them very, very carefully and get rid of them. All these things assist in the success of attack upon you. So get rid of the septic foci and carry out these instructions very carefully. See a doctor if anything needs attention. See a doctor anyway, and be quite certain that the attack isn't as a result of some physical condition like a brain tumor and so on. Try and stop taking sleeping draughts. Try and stop taking sleeping draughts or any sort of sedatives, but do tell your doctor if he has prescribed them that you are stopping them, and give him your reasons for it, that you don't at the moment need them so much. When you have dealt with these simple facets of life, then quietly affirm to yourself, I have undertaken the most important measures that are needed to ward off this attack. I've listened to the advice of Dr. Baker. He has a reputation for knowing his way around the inner worlds, the astral world, and so on. I've taken his advice. What else can I do? I have done absolutely everything, and be quite confident that the advice I've given you will help you. If you are more developed, then there is a second type of position that you can take. You can start to use things like the breathing exercise that I gave you. That's one. Use that breathing exercise regularly during the day. Any time that you feel your mind is being the target of attack, use that breathing exercise, and then go and do something active like gardening or about the house or go shopping. But do use the breathing exercise. The next thing that you need to do in the second thing is to practice what we call the discipline against fear, a meditation against fear. I believe it stems from Plato. I'll tell you what it is. Because if there is one thing that opens you to psychic attack and prevents reaction to it on your part, it is fear. Fear is a terrible thing. I'm going to give you this meditation on fear because I left it out of my talk on courage and cowardice, and I promised I would give it to you. I used this in the darkest hours of my life, when I was suspended virtually between two worlds, where I had to leave the materialistic world and was scorned for doing it, where I had to enter a new world and was just a little puppy dog of a neophyte. And I was suspended, as it were, between two worlds. And maybe this will come to you when you feel that you are standing absolutely alone. One had to, on the one side, give up all the things in life which were regarded as security by the outer world, and on the other hand, take on more responsibilities on the inner levels. It was a difficult situation for me. I had to give everything up, and then when I had given everything up, I had to equip myself in medicine. I had to equip myself for 7 years in medicine when I had given up my income and everything I possessed. It was a very, very hard thing to do, and that sort of fear needs combating. Maybe you and yourselves have similar types of fear to deal with. What did I do? I was taught this meditation. Whether it came from Plato, I know not, but the English master taught it to me. Perhaps you know that in any case, when you go to bed at night, and if you are an occultist, you will always go to bed at least 3 nights of the week before 9:30. Never matter whether you go to sleep or not, but go to bed at least 3 nights of the week early. When you go to bed at night, you're lying there quietly, review your actions during that last 24 hours. No more, just the last 24 hours. We tend to do this anyway. We tend to get into bed and lie there. I can see a lovely person whom I love in this audience who suffered all her life with gastric ulcers, writing down very furiously everything I tell her. I'm delighted. When we go to bed at night, in any case, we review the events of the day. They flicker through our minds, as you well know. Now, apply mind control in this respect. Go back from the last thing that you did when you got into bed. Go back and trace the events of the day to your conduct at the dinner table that night, to the events of the afternoon. Had you given sufficient time to your children that day? Go back even further. When you went into the shopping center, had you been distracted and become attached to certain things? Before that, when you had the interview with the bank manager, had you conducted this in a way that your soul would have liked, would have approved of? And you go right back through that 24 hours, as it were, until you last did the exercise. Then that will take you about 20 minutes the first time. The second time, about 10 minutes. Eventually, it can come down to 3 minutes. Before you go to sleep, review the probable things that are going to happen next day. Take them while you're lying quietly there, while your mind is not harassed by this and that. Quietly review the events that are bound to happen next day from the moment you awaken. What you will do when you are confronted with your morning meditation. What would you meditate on? When you go to work and you have to face a colleague who has been, if you like, psychically attacking you for many times, how will you react to his first bitter words at you? Will you turn your cheek, your other cheek to him? How will you react? Will it be along the ways that your soul would approve? And so you go through the events of the next day. If you have an event that's awful, that's coming off next day, this is the time to decide what your conduct's going to be. You've got to face a situation that's coming tomorrow. Face it. Then, whilst you're lying there, in coolness and calmness, see what the best course of action would be. Then when the day comes, you know how to do it. You know that in the quietness of your mind, assisted by your buddhi, your inner nature, you knew what conduct to adopt right through that day. And when the events which you had feared arrive, you know how to deal with them. And stick to it. The next night that comes along, you'll find that it only takes a few minutes to do this meditation. Eventually, a few seconds. And then the meditation can be dispensed with, because no matter what is happening in your life, you don't fear it anymore. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I can vouch absolutely for that meditation, that it will sweep away your fears if you practice it very, very carefully. That's the sort of thing we mean when we talk about occultists beginning to use their nous to defend themselves. And There are one or two more things I want to say. If you really do feel that you are having attacks, astral attacks, and can't defend yourself, I have found pressure on the solar plexus chakram, very, very helpful. Very, very strong pressure there. You can even take a deep breath and resist your hand, as it were. Some people, Dion Fortune and others, have used hot water bottles placed over the solar plexus center. I have found sometimes during my interviews that I've had to place a circle of foil, a soft foil in that region, and that helps from that terrible gnawing drain that seems to occur when people are drawing energy out of you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've exceeded my time tonight, and I want to thank you, and I also would be happy to answer questions, some of them anyway, if you would write them down and hand them immediately to monitors who will collect them. Thank you very much. Does cremation within 3 days of transition destroy the etheric body or the etheric vehicle? Well, the answer here, of course, is that the etheric body is going to be destroyed naturally anyway. The etheric body will disintegrate slowly. At death, the etheric body passes out through an aperture in the head, in the skull bones, through one of the fontanelles, and after a few days, the astral body has, at least the etheric body, the surrounded as it is called by some, slowly evaporates, as it were, and becomes formless or amorphous, and lies like a sort of blue haze above the coffin, as it were, and so on. Now, in cremation, the disintegration of the etheric body is far more rapid, and it is a good thing. The only caution that should be adopted with cremation is not to cremate too quickly. Sometimes there is loss of consciousness in what we call a death coma. In many instances, a person can't signal to you that he is alive, but he is in a death coma. And this has been brought out very recently by the use of the heart-lung machine, that people are often brought back to life who had been pronounced dead. And so we usually say, allow the body to lie for about 24 hours before cremation is attempted. But after that, as quickly as possible, providing that you don't hurt anybody in the family by cremating too quickly. The next question: after 3 complete physical examinations by medical doctors and proclaimed in good health, I still am plagued by a persistent condition in my facial muscles. Is this possession? Well, facial tics, by that I mean jerking movements of the face muscles, are very, very common, and they don't indicate possession at all. Even people who have been very, very well medically examined quite frequently have contractions of muscles and cramps and things like that. And I would suggest that to this person concerned, as you have investigated very carefully orthodox methods, to try homeopathic remedies or the radionic remedy.